The Titanic, legendary, unsinkable passenger liner, and the greatest disaster in maritime history. How did the sturdiest ship of her day sink in just a few hours on that fateful night in April 1912?
There is no single reason for the sinking of Titanic. It was a chain of events, a succession of errors, or bad luck.
We all know the expression to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a very particular set of circumstances which led Titanic to crash into that iceberg. It really is quite incredible.
There's this whole philosophical concept of the vanities of man. We were going to build this thing that can never be destroyed, and then nature answers differently.
Her tragic story was brought to life in the global blockbuster by American director James Cameron. Though the film stays mainly true to the facts, certain scenes take more liberal historical license.
She can stay afloat with the first 4 compartments breached, but not 5. Not 5.
Obviously, there was a film that was made that really brought it to the forefront of people's minds.
Like a film, let's rewind and perhaps change the ending. We'll reveal step by step every decision which could have helped avert the disaster. What if Titanic had changed route? If different choices had been made during construction? Or if the captain himself had acted differently?
One of the greatest myths, as far as Titanic is concerned, is what the iceberg actually did.
I think that the materials played a role in the sinking.
There was a succession of errors, and in my opinion, this was at least partly because the captain did not react appropriately.
Meteorological and atmospheric conditions played an essential role within the incredible set of circumstances that led to Titanic colliding with an iceberg.
World-renowned Titanic experts investigate and share the incredible story of a tragedy that should never have occurred. Among them is French diver and explorer Paul-Henri Nargeolet, whom we interviewed just weeks before he died aboard OceanGate's Titan submersible on its way to visit the Titanic's wreckage. Join us as we rediscover the Titanic and the events leading up to the disaster. April 14th, 1912. Titanic has a date with history. It's 48 hours until the start of her maiden voyage to New York. The world's eyes are fixed on this ocean giant, a showcase for Irish engineering and the pride of those who designed her.
Absolutely, Titanic at the time was very impressive. It was the largest ship of its kind.
The vessel Titanic was a culmination of the best technology in shipbuilding for its time.
The Titanic, when it was built, was the largest man-made moving object.
They really considered it looking like a hotel.
It was considered unsinkable.
The voyage was to be a triumph, and yet it turned into a nightmare. On her 4th day at sea, this great steel giant hit an iceberg and sank in under 3 hours, taking with her close to 1,500 people. The disaster made headlines, sending shockwaves around the world.
When word got back to the States, that was front page news for a lot of reasons, mostly because there was this notion that not even God can sink this ship. The whole Titanic story is a great example of the triumphs of humanity and technology, also the great disaster of humanity with the sinking of it.
How did the greatest ship in the world end up meeting such a dramatic end? 2 separate inquiries were immediately launched to shed light on the reasons for the disaster, except that all they had to go on were witness statements from survivors.
Even though there were witnesses that said that they saw the ship break in half, people still, for some reason, thought that the ship sank intact.
There's still mysteries, there's still contradictions, and there are little bits of information which don't quite fit.
The survivors' witness statements were far from conclusive. Many questions remained unanswered. Could the catastrophe have been avoided? Could Titanic have stayed afloat? And could every single passenger have been saved? There was only one way to find out. As in any criminal case, investigators were missing the material proof that would allow them to corroborate or not the survivors' statements. Only the wreck of Titanic could help them understand what really happened on that fatal night. But in 1912, it was inaccessible. What they did know was that it was 12,500 feet underwater, and at the time, there was no way of traveling to such great depths.
I've heard it told from the oceanographers that we work with that it is as complicated as sending a man or woman to the moon, just because of the pressure that's at the wreck site. It is 100% dark, the light doesn't get down there.
It wasn't until 70 years later that the miracle of technological progress partnered with a generation of pioneering deep-sea explorers that a solution to the impossible was found. The team rose to the extraordinary challenge of plunging into the abyss. In the space of a few decades, the wreck of Titanic had become the holy grail for every modern-day deep-sea adventurer.
There's very few human-occupied vehicles that can dive to 4,000 meters underwater, where you've got pressures of around 6,000 to 7,000 pounds per square inch pushing on the submersible from all directions.
In the summer of 1985, all hopes were pinned on a Franco-American expedition. But for the first 2 months, scientists found nothing.
I saw some wreckage that was obviously from a vessel, and it started, that density of wreckage that we started to come into kept getting greater and greater and greater. And I know that we were all excited.
In the observation room, everyone held their breath. As the little submersible got closer to the wreck, the camera began to reveal scenes that had never been seen before. It was a historic moment. At a depth of 12,500 feet, there lay the object of months of tireless searching on the ocean floor. William and his team's dream had finally come true. They had just discovered Titanic's shipwreck.
The discovery of Titanic's wreck is a major stepping point as far as Titanic's history is concerned. Firstly, of course, it's a massive resurgence of interest, and it sparks this new wave of enthusiasm towards the story and finding out what happened.
Anyone on the ship ever could have predicted the reaction the world had to knowing that Titanic had been found. And that's what was the amazing thing, and it still affects me today, is that to us it was one thing, but to the world it was something much, much bigger and greater.
73 years on from the disaster, this incredible discovery led to the reopening of the inquiry into this tragic maritime accident and helped to finally reveal the answer to the question, could the disaster have been avoided? A detailed analysis of the wreck helped to provide an understanding of what happened aboard Titanic on her maiden voyage. And the revelations are spine-chilling. Firstly, well before the collision, a succession of human errors, exceptional meteorological conditions, and onboard incidents had already set the liner en route to ruin. Next, despite the iceberg's impact, the ship could have stayed afloat if different choices had been made. And finally, it would have been possible to have saved more people during the evacuation process.
There is no single reason for the sinking of Titanic. It was a chain of events, a succession of errors, or bad luck.
To understand what pushed Titanic to the depths, we must travel back to the day of her departure. April 10th, 1912, 4 days before disaster strikes. At Southampton docks, it was a day of celebration. The biggest ship ever to be built was embarking on her maiden voyage from Europe to the United States. She was due to dock into New York 7 days later.
Titanic left Southampton, took on passengers at Cherbourg and then in Queenstown. After Titanic left Ireland, she encountered good weather and calm seas.
As Titanic starts her maiden voyage, crew are starting to get into the regular routines of shipboard life. Passengers are getting used to going around such a large vessel. And there's a very positive, relaxed, enjoyed atmosphere on board.
Everything may have looked like it was going smoothly aboard Titanic, but none of the passengers were aware of the drama unfolding in the coal bunkers beneath them.
For all the optimism going on above decks, there was a slight problem. It's not known exactly when it started, believed to be in Belfast, but one of Titanic's coal bunkers was on fire.
A fire had started in Titanic's hold. Not a fire with flames, but the kind that develops from coal dust that miners know all about. It's very dangerous and extremely flammable.
Could this fire, which started precisely in coal bunker number 6, have led to the sinking of Titanic? Could the fire have damaged the ship's structure? According to some experts, the fire was inconsequential.
Of the fire, there have been claims, of course, not only that it affected the bulkhead, but it affected the hull itself. There is no actual evidence of this. It's unfortunate that there was this fire, but it was very much a red herring in looking for the causes of the disaster.
Despite scientific confirmation, there is still doubt surrounding the consequences of the fire inside Titanic's hull.
Some people would say that that fire raised the temperature of the steel and it could have weakened the wall of one of those bulkheads and resulted in those boiler rooms opening up and water passing through.
The fact remains, despite the fire in the coal bunkers, the shipping company White Star Line deemed postponing the departure unnecessary.
This was perfectly ordinary for the time. The weight and heat of coal as it sat in the bunkers, coupled with humidity down there, often caused spontaneous combustion of coal. And while it was an inconvenience, it happened all the time.
This decision may appear contentious, but it was just the first in a long line of events which could have helped avoid catastrophe. Daytime, April 14th, 1912, 12 hours before disaster strikes. Up until this point, the journey had gone smoothly. The ship was even expected to arrive in New York a day early.
It was a successful voyage. Each day her speed was being gradually increased. Passengers commented on the comfort of the ship and the relative lack of vibration. As the voyage went on, people were having a good time.
But this was without taking into account the most formidable threat any ship faced in the North Atlantic Ocean: icebergs.
As the Arctic winter subsides in January, February, things start to warm up. You have Greenland on one side and Baffin Island on the other, both of which are home to glaciers. These glaciers start to break apart, fall into the sea, and float southwards, forming icebergs. It's a normal, regular process which happens frequently, regularly. It's the return of spring in the Arctic.
As they float south in the freezing waters, these giant blocks of ice inevitably fall into the path of transatlantic ships. Titanic was going to have to travel through this zone at the worst time of the year, a few weeks before or after, and the catastrophe would have never occurred. The week-long delays accumulated during the construction period and the inevitable presence of icebergs at the time of year sealed her fate forever.
When you look at maps of iceberg locations, there's absolutely nothing unusual about finding them off the coast of Newfoundland in April.
How could Titanic have hit an iceberg? At the time, the only way of locating them was with the human eye. The North Atlantic Ocean was a giant motorway regularly navigated by hundreds of ships. 10 years previously, ships had begun to be fitted with a new technology which had revolutionized the shipping industry. It allowed them to communicate important information to one another, such as the presence of these giant ice flotillas. This new technology was radio telegraphy.
The radio had been introduced. This enabled ships to communicate when they're at sea, and over several years it became standard equipment on all of the major North Atlantic liners.
People were starting to use it to send warnings and that sort of thing.
This was one of the things which had really reduced the number of iceberg collisions in previous years and was a major advance.
In 1912, Titanic was equipped with the very latest in radio technology. It had a range of 400 miles, making it the most powerful in the world. And on April 14, 1912, between 9 a.m. and 11 p.m., radio operators had received several dozen alerts.
As Titanic steams on, radio messages of ice warnings start to come in, ultimately from 14 different ships.
These messages included information about the ice that was ahead. Titanic's captain and officers were well aware that they were heading into an ice zone.
At this point, Titanic's fate was not yet sealed. But unfortunately, one man's decisions were about to change that. Titanic's captain was Commander Edward John Smith. Age 62, he was the world's most seasoned seaman.
Is Captain Edward John Smith, a man with 49 years' experience at sea. He'd risen through the ranks and was one of the highest paid mariners in the world.
Before Titanic, he'd captained 16 ships owned by White Star Line. This was someone with a reputation for keeping his cool, for his temperance, who was very well liked by passengers and crew alike.
It was his final voyage, because upon arrival in New York, he was due to start his retirement, so he wasn't even coming back.
When this experienced captain received the ice warnings, he naturally changed the ship's trajectory.
He rerouted slightly southwards, which would extend the journey a little.
But was that decision enough? Crossing that zone was like moving through a minefield. As the sun began to set on April 14, 1912, other ships located in the same area as Titanic decided to halt and wait for daylight, aware of the danger these icebergs represented.
Californian was the closest ship as the crow flies, and in terms of miles, roughly 20 miles from Titanic, and she had turned her engines off on the far side of the ice field.
Unfortunately for Titanic and her 2,200 passengers and crew members, Captain Smith did not make the same decision.
He knew there was an ice field ahead, and he knew the temperature had dropped and they needed to be on their guard. And yet, Titanic did not reduce speed.
When you receive telegrams telling you there are icebergs everywhere, if you don't do anything, then there's some kind of problem. At the very least, you reduce your speed.
This terrible decision brought Titanic ever closer to her tragic fate, but this human error needn't have occurred. Despite his many years of experience, Captain Smith was overconfident and his decisions had grave consequences. 11 p.m. The ship continues through the icy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean at a rate of 22 knots, or over 24 miles an hour. Captain Smith did not know it yet, but what would soon have been the crowning moment of his career was about to become the greatest fiasco in maritime history, sending him and 1,500 passengers to their deaths. Despite this human error, at that moment the catastrophe could still have been avoided. That is, until a new factor became a part of the equation. Much harder to predict, it would lead Titanic straight towards the iceberg.
We all know the expression to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a very particular set of circumstances which led Titanic to crash into the iceberg.
11:30 p.m., 10 minutes before impact. As was his custom, Captain Smith went to bed, leaving his second-in-command in charge of the bridge.
When Smith retired for the night, he ordered quote, to be woken if it becomes at all doubtful. So he's very much on standby. And of course the officers take this seriously as well.
Both men were relying on the people with the most important job on board a ship in the middle of the night, the lookouts. Perched in the crow's nest at the front of the ship, these two men were Titanic's eyes. The safety of the entire ship rested upon their shoulders. Except that on the night of April 14th, 1912, the situation was suboptimal.
The ship was at the center of a vast anticyclone. The weather was therefore extremely calm. The waters were still. No wind, no clouds, no rain, no storm. And there was no moon either.
On moonless nights, when the sea is calm, you cannot see the edges at the bottom of an iceberg. Usually you can see the white fringe around the bottom of an iceberg, but not that night.
Worse still, the lookouts lacked one essential item: binoculars. At the time, these were a lookout's principal means of watching the horizon at night. But unfortunately, they were inaccessible, and Captain Smith was well aware of this. A few days earlier, he had made a decision that turned out to have very serious consequences.
As preparations develop for Titanic's maiden voyage, Smith orders a reshuffle of officers.
A few hours before their departure from Southampton, one of Titanic's officers, a certain David Blair, was dismissed by the captain. This surprising decision had one major consequence, which was that unwittingly, David Blair did not leave empty-handed.
Now, as Blair departs Titanic, unfortunately, he unwittingly takes with him a small key. It's to a locker for the crow's nest, and it's believed that this locker contained the lookout's binoculars.
Could these binoculars have helped to avoid the collision? During the inquiry carried out directly after the disaster, Frederick Fleet, one of Titanic's lookouts, was asked this very question.
Frederick Fleet at the inquiry went so far as to say, if I had had binoculars, I might have seen the iceberg.
Was that true? It's hard to know for sure, but if it was, it would be awful to think such a tiny oversight could result in such a grand-scale disaster. (11:38 p.m.) Titanic was advancing in the total darkness at a speed of 21 knots, just over 24 miles per hour. The surface of the water was completely still. When suddenly, the two men in the crow's nest saw a dark shape in front of them.
They ring the ship's bell 3 times, and they pick up the phone to the bridge. Sixth officer answers, "What did you see?" "Iceberg, right ahead. Thank you."
When the lookouts see the iceberg, it's 500 meters away. Titanic was 250 meters long, so if we count in Titanics, the iceberg was 2 Titanics away from Titanic.
500 meters was the fateful distance that separated the ship from the worst obstacle she could have encountered on her journey. 11:39 p.m. William Murdoch, the ship's second-in-command, had no choice but to rise to the challenge looming ahead of him. He had to make a crucial decision in order to avoid hitting the iceberg head-on. There was no time to reflect. He had to act fast. According to James Cameron's film, he ordered the ship to be put into reverse. But that's not what really happened. Cameron took certain liberties with the script to serve his storyline, but standard procedure, as well as witnesses on the bridge, indicate that the engines were shut down rather than put into reverse. This is what really happened.
Murdoch orders hard to starboard on the wheel, runs to the engine telegraphs and orders all stop.
A ship the size of Titanic doesn't turn on a dime. It doesn't stop very, very quickly.
Titanic very slowly starts to move to port.
The ship started to turn, but not enough.
They were going too fast. It was too late to start turning.
Unfortunately, by that time, the collision was unavoidable.
11:40 p.m. At the surface, it seemed Titanic could make it round the huge ice mountain. But underwater, a collision was unavoidable.
berg comes into contact with her starboard bow, and tons of ice fall onto her well deck.
At that moment, the majority of passengers were unaware of the collision and the terrible tragedy that would follow.
A few people did feel it a little more than the others. They felt a slight sway. They saw in their whiskey glasses that the boat was tilting a little. But many people didn't notice anything at all.
What was happening beneath Titanic's waterline? Was her hull robust enough to withstand such an impact? To find out, we must go back 3 years earlier to the shipyard in Belfast. It was here, in Harland & Wolff's world-renowned shipyard, that Titanic was built. No expense was spared in order to ensure she would be the safest ship the world had ever seen.
The priority really was passenger safety.
The ship's keel was laid, and the shipbuilders then proceeded to construct the double bottom. And this was an enormously strong structure. In fact, the double bottom was so deep that a man could walk the double bottom without having to stoop.
This double bottom was unique. It provided her with an extra shield to protect against every ship's biggest threat, flooding. Were there to be a collision at the bottom of the hull, this revolutionary system would stop water flooding the interior of the rest of the boat. And Titanic's designers had even gone one step further in the name of safety.
From there, 366-foot tall frames are added, creating the main skeleton of the ship.
This metallic juggernaut skeleton was then covered in the most solid and the most robust material available. More than 2,000 steel plates from world-class Scottish and Irish steelmakers covered this colossal vessel to guarantee total resistance.
So Harland & Wolff use the best materials. There's no monetary limit. And so the metalwork used was the best available for the time.
But on April 14th, 1912, would this newly built ship withstand the pressure of an iceberg? Or on the contrary, would it sound the death knell for this ocean colossus, revealing her to be nothing more than a giant with feet of clay?
One of the greatest myths, as far as Titanic is concerned, is what the iceberg actually did. Now, the newspapers of the day reasoned that for an unsinkable ship to sink, it had to be massive. And images of the period depicted this great tin opener tear alongside a third of the ship.
If you believe the film script, then at the point of collision, the iceberg slashed like a dagger through the steel plates covering Titanic's hull. So was it this huge gash that sunk the ship? The full story didn't come out until 84 years after Titanic sank during an exploration of the wreck. What it revealed suggests that despite the brutal impact of the iceberg, catastrophe could once again still have been avoided. July 1996, the site of Titanic's demise. A headlining scientific expedition to explore the ship's ruins is in preparation. The aim is to inspect the wreck at the point of impact with the iceberg. The idea was to find an answer to the crucial question that still kept this legendary ship shrouded in mystery. What was the damage caused by the iceberg's impact?
Once the Titanic was discovered and once we started doing expeditions, we started understanding more and more about how the impossible did in fact happen.
But it was a devilishly complex task. When Titanic hit the bottom of the ocean at a speed of 38 miles per hour, her prow became buried deep in the seabed under a 10-meter deep layer of sediment.
When the prow hit the bottom, it was buried in the sediment, like the tip of an arrow. It pushed and pushed and pushed until there was enough resistance for the whole thing to come to a halt. So the prow got buried, and this mountain of sediment rose up in front of it. So the idea was to use a drilling sonar probe, which would let us see past the sediment to what was behind it.
But to use this probe, they needed to go down to the shipwreck at a depth of 12,500 feet. At the time, there were only 3 submarines in the world capable of doing that, one of which was built in France, the Nautil. This little submersible, designed by the French Research Institute for Exploration of the Sea, has some unusual capabilities. Frenchman Paul-Henri Nagelet, one of the Titanic shipwreck's most renowned experts, led the team aboard the Nautil.
The Nautil is a submarine designed for scientific exploration, which consists of a titanium sphere with a 2-meter interior diameter, which is actually quite big for this sort of submarine. And on the sphere are 3 portholes in triangular formation, 2 looking down and 1 looking up. There are lots of cameras to record everything, and searchlights, of course, because you're in complete darkness, so you absolutely need searchlights.
So for years, we could only speculate about the damage on the hull. And in 1996 was the first opportunity to begin to see the damage that we always thought was a 300-foot-long gash.
The inquiry had concluded there was a 300-foot gash along the hull, and so the ship had sunk in an hour and a half. But that doesn't make sense.
Paul-Henri Nagelet can be certain of this because the evidence collected by the probe is incontestable.
We realized that actually there were probably 6 gashes that were not all at the same height. It's as though the iceberg had left claw marks in the hull.
Relatively speaking, the damage from the iceberg was quite small.
The average height of each of these splits is barely 1 inch. Hardly the gash that the popular press had predicted.
The iceberg had therefore not gouged the ship in any serious way. The steel had held fast. Put the 6 splits together and they'd create a hole the size of a front door, negligible for a ship on the scale of Titanic.
It wasn't a big gash, it wasn't a huge hole in the side of the ship. It was a very narrow opening that went on for a long distance. And that opening was caused by the plates buckling.
Put simply, the steel plates covering the hull of Titanic buckled under the iceberg's impact. But the splits were located at the most fragile points of construction, the joints between the plates. The quality of the steel was therefore no longer in doubt. The focus was now on the rivets at the joints.
We could see evidence of empty rivet holes that suggested it was a seam that opened and not the fracture of a plate that we had originally thought years prior.
This analysis confirmed it was the rivets that broke under the force of the impact. And this begs new questions. Were they strong enough? Were they built to withstand such an impact? And above all, had they been properly screwed in? To find out, we need to return again to 1909 and to Harland and Wolff's shipyard in Belfast. In 1909, rivets were a fundamental element of shipbuilding. They may be small, but they played a major role in ensuring a ship was watertight. Building Titanic required a colossal 3 million rivets.
At the time, in shipbuilding, in bridges and other structures, riveting was the way that you held those plates together.
Fitting them was a huge challenge. They had always been fitted by hand by a team of riveters in which each person had a very precise role.
How the plates would have been assembled is they would have been prepared in place with pre-driven holes. Then then you'd have a hot rivet that would be thrown up on the structure, straight off a fire, pass through the hole, and you'd have two men who would hammer alternately to form the second head. And then as it would cool, it would shrink and hold the plates together.
These shipbuilding experts only had a few seconds to fix each rivet in place to ensure each one was fully watertight. One wrong move and the ship would no longer be safe from flooding. To ensure efficient progress, Titanic's shipyard was using a new invention, the height of modern technology, a hydraulic riveter.
The difference was that they were beginning to use machines to rivet more consistently and more quickly. It was like 12 times quicker to use a machine than do it by hand.
The U-shaped machine was at the cutting edge of technology and provided users with a double advantage. Not only did it considerably speed up the pace of construction, it also used rivets made of a material that was less fragile than the usual wrought iron: steel.
This is using steel rivets rather than wrought iron. They are slightly stronger, they can be fitted more quickly. This is something which speeds up construction and gives a stronger, more stout frame to the vessel.
But this revolutionary tool also had its limits. Firstly, it was difficult to find enough laborers qualified to use the new hydraulic riveters. Secondly, these enormous machines were hard to maneuver, especially in the more cramped parts of the shipyard.
In the bow and the stern, in the ends of the ship, it's very tight and it's difficult to move these very large machines through the gantry.
To facilitate the riveting and to keep up the pace of construction, White Star Line made a decision, the consequence of which they did not foresee. It was a decision which indicates once again that the catastrophe could have been avoided. They decided to use two different types of rivet. The center of the ship, the most fragile section subject to the greatest amount of stress during a voyage, was built using these robust steel rivets and a hydraulic riveter. But the steel sheets at the prow and the stern were treated differently.
The bow and the stern were the areas that were riveted with iron. Partly because it's tight spaces, you need someone to do this by hand, and the riveters liked working with iron. It was faster, it was less expensive.
This choice inevitably begs the question, would the rivets at the prow of Titanic have withstood the iceberg's impact if they had been made from steel instead of wrought iron? To find the answer, further exploration of the wreckage was required in a mission that was only made possible 86 years after the sinking of Titanic. August 10th, 1998. A landmark day in Titanic's history. Paul-Henri Nargeolet and his team were about to breach limits of technology in order to assess the ship's structure. The French explorer was well aware that this type of mission, 12,500 feet down, had a time limit and that the risk of accident was multiplied exponentially at such depths. He had been tasked with one of the biggest challenges in the history of deep-sea exploration: to collect and return to the surface a fragment of the hull of the most famous shipwreck in the world.
We started looking for a piece that wasn't too enormous down there because we found some pieces and I was looking at them and thinking, that weighs at least 200 tons. No way we can bring that back up.
After a detailed exploration of the sea, Paul-Henri Nargeolet located the perfect fragment. A 20-ton section, equivalent in weight to a semi-trailer with a surface of 280 square feet. It wasn't a section of the prow hit by the iceberg. It was a piece of the starboard section of the hull, located at first-class cabin level. This piece was more easily accessible, and studying it would reveal the answers to several rivet-related questions.
The advantage of this piece was that it had a lot of rivets and it had portholes. It was very representative of the ship's construction process as a whole.
It was the first time in the history of humanity that such a feat had been carried out. This fragment of the hull from the most famous ship in history was the missing link in a so far impossible investigation. But there was more to come. During the same expedition, the deep-sea experts also unbelievably managed to collect some of the wrought iron rivets near the prow of the wreck. Would this evidence help to reveal if the secrets of Titanic's construction had played a part in the disaster? Could they be used to work out if the tragedy could have been avoided if different construction choices had been made?
Before some of the forensic and scientific expeditions had been conducted at Titanic, there were many, many theories about imperfect metal being used, poor quality steel.
Where did the truth lie? Jennifer Hooper is an expert in metallurgy. She had made it her personal aim to solve the mystery. Finally, she could measure the quality of these little joints. What she discovered was beyond anything she could have imagined.
In the end, any ship may have sank as a result of that collision. What we want to do is really and truly understand, given what was considered state-of-the-art, what role did it play?
(1999), Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, United States. Jennifer Hooper's thesis focused on Titanic's rivets, particularly those made of wrought iron at the prow, where the collision occurred. She wanted to know their precise level of resistance.
We used microscopes to look at the surface and look at the composition. We also did mechanical testing to try to understand how strong and tough those rivets and the rivet material was. We also did computer modeling to simulate collisions that would force those rivets to break, so we could analyze all those different things.
This detailed inspection revealed the presence of slag. This solid residue, which looks like tiny stones, is a result of the fusion of metallic minerals. Its presence is completely normal. What was less normal was its level of concentration.
When you compare the iron in the Titanic to other material like that, you see very large pieces of slag. That indicates that it was not sufficiently worked.
According to the American researcher, the acceptable quantity of slag in a wrought iron rivet at the time was a maximum 3% of the composition of the piece. But when she examined some of the rivets used to fix the steel sheets to the ship's prow, she noticed abnormally high levels of slag. Some rivets were composed of up to 40% slag.
We were seeing very large particles, and the reason that's important is because under high stress or strain, those particles can cause weakness. So it's not really a question of whether it would have sank, it was really just how fast.
But could the rivets have more easily withstood the impact if the slag percentage had been lower? As far as the experts are concerned, without a doubt.
It was kind of what was expected at the time. There's some variability in it. But again, the ship was designed very well and would have met today's standards for a passenger liner.
Titanic's structure was at the height of technological progress and highly capable of containing a flood, not just because of her double bottom, of course, but also because of the hull's interior skeleton, which was divided into 16 separate compartments via 15 watertight partitions.
The partitions were a relatively new feature of shipbuilding, and Titanic had a large number of them. She had been very well designed.
To ensure she remained completely watertight, these sliding doors needed to be closed. They could be locked remotely via a switch, or thanks to a simple automatic detection system using a float.
So in case of an accident or an emergency, the bridge could close those watertight doors and keep water from one watertight compartment from getting into another watertight compartment.
Thus, if one of the compartments flooded, it could be completely cut off from the others to avoid the flood spreading. Thanks to this amazing feat of technology, Titanic was able to stay afloat with up to 4 flooded compartments.
Most other ships' 2 compartments would sink it. So this was unparalleled with the amount of safety, the amount which could potentially be damaged, and the ship would survive.
11:50 p.m. Captain Smith sends Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect, to urgently check the damage to the ship's compartments. The man knew every nook and cranny of his ship. For him, she was the pinnacle of his young and brilliant career, still so full of promise. And yet, that night his dreams of glory were suddenly over. When he inspected the compartments, there was no doubt.
He's later seen, very shortly after this, going up the grand staircase, ignoring passengers, which was unusual for him, taking the steps 3 at a time, and was described as having a look of absolute terror on his face.
The news felt unreal. The world's first truly unsinkable ship was going to sink in the North Atlantic Ocean on her maiden voyage. Here, in James Cameron's celebrated film, Thomas Andrews, played here by actor Victor Garber, explains why.
She can stay afloat with the first 4 compartments breached, but not 5. Not 5.
Except that's not entirely accurate. The collision damaged the rivets of 6 compartments, not 5.
5 compartments were open, the 6th was also taking in a minor amount of water.
The reality was that too many compartments were flooded. In such conditions, Titanic's ultra-modern, watertight system was useless.
Think of it like a whole bunch of cups, and that when one fills up, it starts going, the water keeps coming in that one, but it goes and starts filling into the next cup.
Despite the design of the watertight compartment, Titanic simply experienced flooding that she was not designed to handle.
There was no way of counteracting that amount of water, and the sheer weight would ultimately take her to the bottom.
12:05 p.m., 25 minutes since Titanic hit the iceberg. Catastrophe was now unavoidable. An unsinkable ship was going to sink. However, it was still possible to save the lives of the 2,200 passengers and crew members. Californian, a ship which halted her crossing due to the large number of icebergs reported on her route, was close to the troubled passenger liner.
Californian was the closest ship as the crow flies, and in actual miles, less than 20 miles away from Titanic. And she had turned off her engines on the far side of the ice field.
The evidence is that Californian was in visual distance of the sinking Titanic.
But luck was not on Titanic's side. At that moment, her many Mayday messages sent out by radio had gone unanswered. So what was going on aboard Californian?
Californian had turned off her radio at 11:23 p.m. It wasn't compulsory to keep a radio operator on call. Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. If it had been just 10 minutes earlier, Californian may well have heard Titanic's distress signal.
If Californian's radio operator had stayed on duty, there's every chance that he would have heard Titanic's distress messages.
10 minutes earlier, and Californian's radio operator could have transmitted the distress signal. Without realizing it, he had condemned a large number of Titanic's passengers to certain death. 12:55 p.m. Titanic has been taking on water for an hour and 15 minutes. By this stage, everyone on board the ship was aware she was going to sink and that the lifeboats were the only way to survive.
As time went on, the passengers became more panicked. Crew members managed the stress in various ways. Some made use of their firearm to reestablish order.
4:10 a.m. The people in the water had frozen to death. The survivors in the lifeboats were attempting to stay warm. Then suddenly, a ship appeared, Carpathia.
Carpathia arrived about 2 hours after Titanic had disappeared. So it was an anxious wait for people in the lifeboats. They were anxiously waiting for help to arrive.
Though she was further away than Californian, she had received Titanic's distress signals and had redoubled her efforts despite the presence of icebergs to come to her rescue as quickly as possible.
The priority was to bring in all the lifeboats and get everyone on board to warm them up, since they had spent several hours in the lifeboats on a freezing night.
Of Titanic's 2,200 passengers and crew members, only 1,178 of them could have been saved on the lifeboats. But the actual loss of human life was much higher. 1,500 people died in the freezing waters of the Atlantic, including Captain Smith and architect Thomas Andrews. With only 711 survivors, this shipwreck is the most terrible in maritime history, giving the story of Titanic legendary status. Despite the human errors which led to her sinking, Titanic remains a technological feat of her time which became embroiled in a tragic chain of events.
There were certain elements which in themselves were not major, but put all of these individual chains together and you start to get a major incident. Take out any of those links and you could have prevented it.
There was a succession of errors, and I think it's partly down to the captain, who didn't react appropriately. He didn't act as he should have done.
It was really down to human as opposed to scientific error. Despite everything that was said about icebergs and mirages, the main reason was probably the ship's high speed.
Since that terrible night of April 14th, 1912, Titanic has become a monument of the depths. Her legendary status not only attracts professional researchers, wealthy tourists have recently been able to take in the privileged view of the wreck from inside a little submersible known as Titan, designed by American company OceanGate, until this commercial initiative became a monumental fiasco. On June 18, 2023, this little submarine gave way to the pressure of the depths and imploded. 111 years after she sank, Titanic had claimed more victims. Among them was French explorer Paul-Henri Nargeolet, who died at the age of 77, just a few weeks after granting us his final interview. This man devoted his life to Titanic and played a huge role in the discovery of many of the elements that have helped advance the inquiry into the reasons for the disaster, enabling us to answer the question, could the disaster have been avoided?